link. So tell him to go to Living Economy Salon. I can let him in right now.
Or you want to just email me the link?
No, this will be fastest. Tell him to go to Facebook. He's on Facebook.
Are you the computer stuff?
Well, he's going to have to watch it on a computer.
Yeah, I'll have to send it.
I'm talking.
I will in another 2 seconds.
Okay.
So go to Facebook and find Living Economy Salon. Ask to join the group. I'll say yes.
Hollis. Hollis, meet Kit.
Hi. I just made this live.
Is it Hollis David?
No, it's Hollis Doherty.
Okay.
So.
All right, so I'm going online.
It says
To Facebook.
tell him to go to Living Economy Salon. Oh, that's hilarious. It's like there's a delay. It's embarrassing.
Okay, go to Facebook. Just
Tell him to go to livingeconomysalon.com. This will be fastest.
No, no,
Tell
no.
him to go to Facebook. He's on Facebook. Tell him to find our page on Facebook.
No, you're talking to him now.
Okay, Living Economy Salon. Just go to Living Economy Salon on Facebook. Find that as a page. So go to Facebook and find Living Economy Salon. Ask to join the group.
Okay, go in the search and link to the.
Hi, I just made this live.
You're hearing yourself talk 5 minutes ago. Okay, you're here. You're on. If you search for Living Economy Salon on Facebook, did you find it?
Hold on. Yes.
Okay, and then you'll see Hollis' latest update, with a Google Hangout.
What you want to do is ask to join the group. I think he might have to ask to join the group.
Oh, the story hangout. Okay, so members looking for where to ask. 390 members. See all join group. Got it. Okay.
Sweet.
I may have just joined it.
Good.
Without having to ask.
Do you see? Do you see my?
Oh, there you go. Wait, you just
there it
joined.
is.
Great. Do you see the link?
Do I see what?
Okay, now you're a member. Now look at the page and see if you see the link.
Refresh the page. Looking for a link, is that what you're saying? Oh yeah, here we go.
It says we're on a Google Hangout live stream. Watch Living Economy
Okay,
Salon.
got it. All right.
It's actually YouTube Hangout, but it's okay.
Now let's try to see
It's the same thing.
Okay.
Google and.
Wait, are you looking at me?
Well, that link that is about maybe a minute to 2 minutes behind. So as soon as
I see you, Robin.
yay,
So you're on.
Yeah, beautiful.
great, how awesome. So Kit, I'm going to hang up the phone and just stay tuned, and then to our earlier conversation, if you feel inspired to shoot me what you feel, otherwise I'll just introduce you to Ronnie and we'll just set up a time to talk next week. I'm so thrilled that you're interested in this relationship. Yeah, just I'll shoot you up an email tonight, and I'm so grateful for everything, and enjoy whatever you do tonight. Yeah, awesome. Bye. I was just talking with him. He called me out of the blue.
And then,
To our earlier conversation, if you feel inspired to shoot me what you feel, otherwise I'll just
Okay, we're live on YouTube right now. I wonder if I can save
What you're investing in, so it would be there. But with nature.
And I've been ever since. And I had it really wakes me up in the mood, and then I next layer, please.
So basically, following it up.
And we're here up in Richmond.
Yes, exactly.
I only made sure.
Tell us when you're ready, Jamie.
I'm trying to see how to record it.
Yeah, but mainly it's getting the number to you, where I'm coming from. And concentrating it, so they can get it straight kind of going. Get,
And I'm very much
this,
questioning my own.
GDP, you know, it's been measured for productivity, so, you know, hopefully how we need to be changing reality. But, you know, the first one really kind of shows, you know,
I'm trying, yeah, it's totally working. As a matter of fact, right now I'm broadcasting myself looking at the computer, which is annoying, but I'm trying to figure out how to record it. Like, I don't know if this is going to be recorded.
And you can hang out on air, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's already recorded.
It's recorded, so the whole
Yeah.
thing is going to be recorded,
The whole thing is going to be
and then I
recorded.
can download it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's up.
Cool.
It'd be nice if that you could read that thing.
That frame,
Maybe I go a little
you're
bit
sitting
closer.
there, it looks like something from a sci-fi flick.
Yeah. I'm
Like
just,
you're about to start some
I just want to make it so that we can see that. We can't really see it. That's
might get washed out.
It's super washed out. It might be
Well,
hard.
it might just be, you
Yeah.
know, the content that you're speaking to is a lot more important.
We're live. Yeah. We're live. We are live.
Live, we're good.
Okay.
So, because we're on camera, everybody, we're going to do more presentations. Really as much interaction.
No. I'm saying, we're gonna behave differently, maybe not too much.
Yeah, maybe once,
Paul's will be here, you said that.
okay. Oh,
I love those images. They look like irises, like eyes.
so
Are you there?
Yeah.
Paul's in the middle?
sure, why not?
Oh, wait a minute. Okay.
Is that because you're touching your computer?
Mainly it's
Lost
the,
signal again.
Did we lose it?
Oh, there you are. Okay, you're back.
Okay.
But it's not on,
Yeah, so we need to shift it.
Does the computer go to sleep automatically? You might need to disable the go to sleep thing.
What's up?
The computer keeps going to sleep?
something.
Because then if the computer sleeps, the projector might think, oh no, it's
I don't want to be on
Very
it.
good. Now I've got
It's not my
something
face,
that's,
but I'm going to introduce it, and then you guys will.
Okay. We can do
There you are.
this. So you wanna be on this.
You're back.
Because I don't need to be on the screen. So
Okay,
you
well,
sit there.
Turn it. Okay.
Yeah. And then, so I'll introduce, and then you guys go.
Okay, you
Okay, whatever you say.
You're back.
am I back?
I'm not ready. I get.
Cool.
I don't want people to watch me snacking, which is what I'm going to be doing.
I'm not doing it. I can't be the only one snacking.
Is that your strategic?
So it's not obviously working now.
Or is it working?
It's working.
You can't quite see it.
It's already working. We're on Hangouts on here.
No, I'm saying the screen.
Yeah, we're not being.
Hi, everybody. You know we're here, but we're not quite ready yet, obviously, because we're not talking yet. So Don and Chris and Hollis, we're going to start up in a moment. We have a small audience tonight. We are the audience together.
Okay, well, we're ready, so.
Okay. I'm turning my phone down.
Maybe I'll announce from over here.
You want to sit from over here?
No, I just. Huh. Okay. So, welcome to the Living Economy Salon. This is our small August version of the salon. So our evening is social impact investing with two social impact investors. I'm really excited to hear what Greg's been up to. Seth just started a new job. I'm excited to hear about that. And the Living Economy Salon, we started it in 2009, really originally, and then got going more in earnest in 2011. We've been doing this for a while now.
Oh.
And our blog is livingeconomysalon.com, and it's our sort of mission is we're committed to fostering a dialogue around new economic models that foster a more fair and abundant economy for all living things. And I have a little announcement that I'll make.
Yay!
I did an interview of this on this little, I almost want to say it's almost cable access, but it's really just a TV show on one of those thousands of networks that we have now. So it's kind of on a smaller network. It's also available online, but it was a show called Conscious Revolution. And he was interested in this new money idea, and he interviewed me on it. And when I was done, I was like, you know, if you're looking for content, let me tell you, I can help you out with that. So now we're talking about me actually having a show. And the first one is going to be like 12 episodes. And I can like bring in speakers, which is probably like every single one of you I could bring in and do an interview, and then we'll edit it into a 30-minute show, which is like, this is almost exactly what I've been wanting to do, except they actually have a budget, so it's not going to be me just pulling favors from friends of mine with cameras. And yeah, and so I'm actually going to be able to like probably name the show and create the show and be the host of the show, and then these guys have all the
That is monumental broadcast to the planet.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like it'll be on some kind of small network in one of those thousands of channels that you have initially. It's going to be a huge following. But also, I said, well, would it be available online? He said, yeah. So it's like they do all the production values, and I can get these shows and put them up online. So why not? So it's like, we just started talking, but I think it's the outgrowth of what we've been doing with Living Economy Salon now with production. So you know, and making it accessible to everybody. So every single one of you with these salons, it's always been like our audience members are just as qualified as our speakers. Usually, we're usually in a room of people of speakers.
Yeah.
So pretty much everybody who attends the economy salons, I want to talk to you about what you're doing and maybe see if we can do the show.
I'm so excited. Yay!
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
Okay, so now, and I'll expect you guys to further introduce yourselves and what you're doing, and to Seth and Greg.
Okay. Thank you. And Hollis, how much time do we want to spend tonight together?
45 minutes or an hour?
Well, so we'll spend about 45 minutes-ish together, and then we want to spend time with you who are in the room. And I'm sorry we can't quite get questions from you online unless it's not.
I'm sure there's a way, but
we didn't set it up for you to ask questions, so.
Yeah, how about this? Tell them they can ask a question on the Living Economy Salon webpage.
So you can ask a question on the Living Economy Salon webpage.
No, on Facebook. On Facebook comments.
On the Facebook group.
Yeah.
Or you can.
And we'll check it after we're done. If anybody were to comment on the Facebook.
Yeah.
Where I put the link to this.
And everyone in the community can answer the question.
Yeah.
So it'll be just so much fun. We'll just have a comment explosion of ideas and sharing, because the brilliance in the room is more than just brilliance in one mind, is all of us together, which is, I think, kind of the point of the discussion, right?
That's right. That's right.
You know, this whole idea of a living economy, I feel, isn't it, Hollis? It's about relationships and connection and place. We actually started this conversation around the Economics of Peace conference in 2009.
Well, we had done 2 events right before the Economics of Peace.
Right. So right before the Economics of Peace, but I think it really started anchoring for us around that time.
Yeah.
And the insight that we hold is, well articulated by our friend Judy Wicks, who said she ran her business to maximize relationships, and from that she created a very profitable and very sustainable business. And that business enabled her to see her business as a network of relationships that she maximized. And then from that network, she created a community group called the Sustainable Business Network, and from that created the Business Alliance of Local Living Economies, which is now the largest and fastest growing socially responsible business movement in the country. And there's 80 cities with something like 35,000 businesses, and it's very robust, based on the whole idea that we add quality of life and quality of relationships back into the equation and relatedness to each other in an economic context. And I feel that's like the heart of what it is that why we do what we do, right? And I think why all of us come here, because we want to be in better relationships. And I'll speak for myself. My journey has been one of living in spiritual community when I was in college, studying economics, business, math, and computer science, and coming from that foundation while I'm studying the abstractions. And then as an impact investment advisor, Robin Shank, my colleague, and I, Robin is, we're a team here in Santa Monica. We're part of a small firm called Stakeholders Capital with offices in New York and Amherst and Santa Monica. And the whole concept of stakeholders is that we are in recognition that there's many different stakeholders, there's many different participants in an economy, a living economy, and we want everyone to be in better relationship with each other. And that informs the movement of capital. And those of us that manage money in this way, we think about the relationship with nature, with each other, with community, and the quality of life as a means of driving the way we work with money. And that's a very new concept for many, and for many it is not. And there's a lot of people in the middle, and we're all here to explore these ideas together. With respect to the idea of relationships, there's been some conversations we had tonight as we all gathered here around the importance of everyone in the room having so much knowledge and so much experience and so many ideas. And a lot of times for all of us, myself included, we found that the missing piece in the success of the project we want to create is based on the missing piece is relationships. How do we build better teams? How do we build better community? How do we create better outcomes for people in relationship with each other? And how do we build economies based on people seeing and feeling and hearing each other more effectively? And from that, then we can start talking about value exchange and value creation, and then we can talk about capital. And that's just giving you a little bit about me and a little bit about our story. And I'll stop here, and I'd love Seth to share a little bit about who you are, what brought you here, and what you're doing.
But before you stop, we do have like this introductory slide over here.
Right.
Which maybe
no, I can see it, but I want to make sure that people on they don't see it.
I think it's kind of washed out.
Okay.
The screen is not
Looks
showing
like a
up.
delicate
The screen
connection.
is showing up, but the volume is good, and we
Okay.
can see you and Seth.
Okay, beautiful. Maybe what one of us can do at some point is to post it on the Living Economy Salon
This is
Facebook
recording,
page. Yeah, no,
so I can actually edit that and add the slide.
you just add it in.
And I'm on. Well, I'd have to.
Yeah, we can do it right now. Yeah.
Okay.
So for right now, and it's on my blog, Sustainable Wealth. But for right now, the picture is ecosystems interacting with society, and there's two different big circles. One is all the different things in the biosphere and all the different components of the ecosystem. And the words I'm going to read to us, it says interaction, coevolution, and coadaptation of the human social system with the ecosystem. And basically the idea is that the ecosystem is our planet. It's our biosphere that we are all held in, and that we as human beings have society, and within that we have economic activity and our interactions and agreements. And if you were to hold the concept that they're separate, well, then that's where most people are, but we actually realize that one contains the other contains the other. Nature contains society, which contains the economy. And what we're trying to do in the idea of economics and relationships is to weave better relationships between these systems and recognize the whole system approach to human activity and therefore economics. And this whole systems approach is actually a very sound and robust science, and it was actually the paradigm that most people lived from in ancient culture. And we are also many systems. We call it systems theory. We call it complexity economics.
Complex adaptive systems.
Complex adaptive systems. And I remember when I was asked to give a talk about systems thinking, and I was like struggling as to how do you describe something as complex as complexity systems thinking. And I was searching around the internet, and I found an article where someone said, if you want to understand systems thinking, you look at a 14-year-old and how they relate to their friends. Because the analysis that a 14-year-old girl needs to do to know all of her friends and all of their relationships and who knows what and who doesn't like who and all these different pieces, that's way more complex than a stock analysis. And we already have systems thinking embedded in us. It's hardwired. We just kind of forgot to use this computer for what it's built for. It's all based on relationships and relational value, and the complexity that we have is profound. And if we simply apply that to those of us in this adult world, then we actually will have a much more effective way just by maximizing the quality of relationships and using the software we've got to actually make a better system. And that's kind of what guided a lot of the things that I've been behind and all the work that I've done with, and Robin and I have been doing for years with the Green Economy Think Tank and Green Business Networking, and all of us have been doing with the Living Economy Salon. And then the conversation tonight is about how do we apply these insights to capital, or better yet, how do we ask these questions in the context of capital and bring better communities together to relate better together so we can actually design better capital structures within the system we've got. We've got a bunch of tools, but how do we repurpose the tools to create better outcomes based on what we know today, not when the tools were designed? So that
right. No, that was part of the.
That was good. Right?
That was great.
Okay,
that was really and the lead-in I really liked about that slide was the idea around social ecology, because when I got started into this was in 1977. I went to a school up in Plainfield, Vermont, Goddard College, and the Institute for Social Ecology. It was a summer program. A gentleman by the name of Murray Bushin sponsored that program, but he brought in really, I think, the leading thought leaders in this space at that time. Folks like Amory and Hunter Levins in '77, Barry Commoner, and a lot of the folks, we're seeing, I think, a reemergence of a lot of that consciousness that was happening kind of in the '60s, '70s into this, small is beautiful. A lot of who was the great inventor of the geodesic dome, Bucky Fuller. Those guys were just amazing at that time, and it really set me on this course of really trying to understand not only to appreciate that structure, but also to recognize that the world that we live in and around really either didn't understand it and also wasn't quite tolerant of a lot of that. So, so we grew up on this farm in the summer. We would fix old wind generators that were brought in from the Midwest that were put up on farms in the 1920s and 1930s. We built solar hot water collectors. There were PVs, but they were just. I remember buying kind of like this hard hat with a little motor and a beanie on it, where the sun would, attract that and they would spin it, that was about all you could get out of PV back then, But it was really, and like you said, it was about relationship. I mean, we lived very much in kind of in a community setting. We cooked our own meals. We really shared a lot of that experience together, and it was something that stuck with me as I started to also. Well, we would go to like nuclear protests and anti-nuclear protests, I should say, and very active in a lot of the social environmental issues of the time up in the Northeast. And that was pretty eye-opening from a guy from Memphis, Tennessee, grew up in the South. Although my parents were pretty, on the liberal side, there are shades of that in Tennessee. So from that, I moved into really working within the system, within utility companies at Memphis. 15 years at Memphis Light, Gas, and Water, the largest three-service utility in the country, which gave me an opportunity to really understand electricity, natural gas, water from a community services perspective. It was owned by the city, very much like LADWP. So there was really an alignment of the customer and the ownership structure of that municipality. Spent 5 years with a investor-owned utility company up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and really could see the difference between shareholder investment and investor companies, utilities versus the municipality. But again, it was an understanding of these are very centralized systems, very driven on cost efficiencies, and so you really could understand the underpinnings of the big machine, I would say, that we live on today. The way in which utilities have developed over the last 100 years, but certainly in the last 30 to 50 years, and how that has moved. And where I think some structural changes that we're starting to see within the industry, I think is interesting. So really, it's been a utility perspective and it's been a commodity perspective. At Memphis, we were the first utility to trade futures on the New York Mercantile Exchange. I set up the risk management program, entered into futures contracts, would go up and speak at the New York Mercantile Exchange on how to use futures contracts for hedging, moved over and set up a hedging and risk program with the investor-owned utility, started trading derivatives in addition to underlying physical future contracts, structured portfolios around physical assets as well as financial assets. So it was very much a commodity-driven, not necessarily the capital world. That was kind of a one-off. Certainly the gains and losses would be reflected, but it was really within a large independently owned utility company, investor-owned, or an ownership structure by the city, which has its own interesting dynamics. But so what the key points, and I only have 5 slides. I want to blow through these so we can really get into the conversation. But I think that kind of sets the overview for the conversation, because when you look at electricity, the paradigm that has been in the utility industry and the electricity industry is that it is the growth in the ability to produce more and more electricity that drives our productivity. The more electricity we generate, the more we're able to produce goods and services, and that improves our GDP, a measurement of productivity, We tend to get confused from an economic standpoint that GDP means good well-being, but we're finding that there's really a separation. What we need to look at in our economics today is not just that focused on gross domestic product, but on other measures of well-being, health, environment, a lot of the social ecology elements that we focus on. So when you look at that paradigm that, and working at Memphis, we were the largest distributor of TVA power. Now, TVA was established in the 1930s under the Roosevelt administration, and really to tame the Tennessee River, bring economic development to that impoverished area, and generate a lot of electricity in that process. And so the production of that electricity meant economic growth and jobs. And you see this also up in the Pacific Northwest, Bonneville Power Administration, very similar type of structure. So, and the rate design of those utilities were the more electricity you consume, the cheaper it's going to cost you. And so that was always an incentive to, well, we'll just generate more and we'll produce more, and the GDP will accelerate, and you know, we'll have growth in the valley. But you know, when you look at the numbers, and certainly that's the way pretty much every state in the country has moved. But California has been quite different since the 1970s, putting in a lot of energy efficiency programs, no coal generation in the state since the mid-90s, a big shift in really their paradigm of power generation. And so when you look at the per capita energy consumption of California, it's basically flatlined for the last 30 years, while the growth in GDP has continued to climb, increase at the same rate nationally. Now, one could say, well, that's a paradigm shift, and certainly it is, but you can also take that view and say, well, we are generating electricity in a different way. We're generating it in what Amory Lovins calls megawatts, energy efficiency. Or we're creating efficiencies within the system, and in that process, we're seeing an increase in jobs to promote the energy efficiency, a technology curve that is has really taken off for California. And getting back to this well-being perspective, while yes, we've seen productivity measured in GDP, this last weekend I was looking out over the LA Basin from Riverside, and you could see all the way from Riverside to Mount Baldwin. You couldn't do that 20 years ago, just because of the steel mills, the type of generation that was produced in the valley. And so we took a different path. It's a cleaner path. We have much greater well-being in the valley as a result, and our economy is really thriving in that process. So if you look at Bloomberg has a new energy finance website or what have you, and their projection of installed capacity over the next 20 years, 2012 to 2030, what you'll see is that really the first 1,000 gigawatts of generating capacity is either coal or natural gas based. And then they'll start to layer in a growth of renewables. And this is kind of, I would say, this business as usual trend. So what I think we miss in that process is we look at centralized generation, centralized utilities and generating stations as silos. And we're giving up the opportunities to recognize what we call a nexus in energy, food systems, and water systems. And so if we're going to see really a transition in the paradigm that we are in traditional utility, we have to start to recognize and step out of these silos and start to identify the nexus. Certainly California has, at least in the energy and water, because of 20% of the energy consumed in California is just to move water around the state. And now we're seeing, because of the drought, the challenges not only in energy and moving that water, but now we're seeing agricultural challenges and what that means. So the systems that we've developed that are very strong as a centralized system, we're also starting to see their weaknesses when we find stress to the system. And I guess that was my last gig in the traditional commodity and energy, was with a trading and clearinghouse operation based out of Chicago. And I was managing a $2 billion portfolio of wholesale electricity contracts. And you can start to look at, in the way in which traders typically look at price risk, is like you would look at in a rearview mirror. What's the price history? How much volatility? What are the correlations? They're really looking at signals and trying to make decisions around those signals. And I think the problem with looking at markets from that perspective is they're underpinning ecologies within those systems. So if you're looking at, in California, the big blowout that we saw in 2002, 2001, yes, there were some games that were going on by Enron and a number of generators, but kind of underpinning that was low hydro production coming out of the Pacific Northwest from a drought. They did not have as much snowpack in that region. That usually when May or June starts to hit, you get the snow melt, starts to generate a lot of electricity up there, brings that electricity is shipped into California, and when that didn't happen, power plants in LA had to operate earlier than what they're designed to operate. Usually in July, August, September, they had to come on as early as May. Typically, that's a maintenance cycle for them. And because of the South Coast Air Quality Management District, there are only so many run hours that those plants can operate. So many of them started to face penalties. So you start to see these things have ecological impacts in the system. And if we start to recognize, well, what are those ecological impacts? And traditionally, we've just looked at those in the utility industry and just call them externalities. We won't, really try to monetize those or qualify them in any way. We just know that they're there, and we're going to spread those costs into our rate base when they occur. So, I think, we start to look at systems from a social and an ecology perspective, and that starts to lead into economists like Eleanor Ostrom, 2009 Nobel Prize winner in economics, because of her work in social ecological systems, forestries, fisheries. When we have to deal with our energy needs, our water needs, food systems, we can't rely on those big tech systems because there are underpinnings systems that have to be addressed. And she has found that there are a number of key elements that impact effective management of those systems. One of those is the ability to self-organize within that system. And by that I mean we can't rely on a national regulatory policy, or even a state regulatory policy for that matter. We really have to get down to the community grassroots. We have to address those environmental systems within the communities and within the areas. And we find that by managing it from that perspective, we have better control over its reliability, its resilience, its sustainability of those systems. So what does that mean going forward? Well, I think getting back to Amory Lovins, came out with a book a year ago, Reinventing Fire. And he lays out really 4 pathways that we might see energy production move up until 2050. That business as usual, the traditional coal, and we might try to clean it. We might try to carbon sequester, but it's still the centralized paradigm. Or we may start to move to a more decentralized. And I think we're seeing that particularly in California with a lot of rooftop solar coming in California. It's the fastest growing capacity source of generation in California, in the western U.S. actually. And so as we start to decentralize our energy systems, start to decentralize our food systems and our water systems, then we're able to take greater control, at least on a local. And I think our challenge at a centralized perspective is, well, how can I optimize world food production, or world, how can I address world hunger, or how can I manage an electricity grid that spreads all over the Western Interconnect if I'm localizing those issues? Well, I think the challenges are there, but so are the opportunities, and so are the models that we're starting to see to make that happen. Energy efficiency, demand response, renewables all start to reduce the amount of centralized control, but also to free up resources in water use, in food systems. And we'll start to see this nexus play out in being able to localize some of the solutions that we're looking for. But to do that, we're not looking at investing in big centralized power stations anymore. What are we investing in? And I think that's the next paradigm that we have to look at. And if you look at just like electricity growth with gross domestic product, what we also see in the finance world, if you look at the amount of assets, funds, and assets that are managed by funds throughout the world. This is a chart that lays out really in a logarithmic scale, but there is this direct relationship into the amount of GDP and the amount of assets that a country invests in, the amount of funds, the impact that those funds have. Now, if you're some of these developing countries, we're not seeing as much investment into those countries as we have seen in more developed. But we're seeing a different type of investment strategy, and that has been kind of the impact investing. strategy. And if you look at, even I live in Riverside now, and if you look at communities in Riverside, and I'm sure there are a number in even LA, and you look at the base of the pyramid of economy, you're going to see GDP very much in, right at that threshold to the bottom third of the base of the pyramid, even in California. And so it opens up the opportunity, I think, to start to look at what are the tools, the Grameen Bank, the impact investing strategies, root capital, initiatives that have gone on in a number of these developing worlds that we can actually take into our own communities. And how do we start to empower those communities? We've been trapped in, just as we've seen power generation and a lot of our regulations built during the Roosevelt era, TVA, the Federal Power Act, the Holding Company Act, a lot of the regulations that happened in the 1930s also pertain to investors and accredited investors. And so, I think we're starting to see a shift now of opportunities for us as community to invest in our community. And we're going to see that play out in a variety of ways. That's why at Joint Cutting Edge Capital, Jenny Kasson, John Katovich, I think they're really on the forefront in community and social type of investing through direct public offerings that open up the opportunity for the small investor to help and support the small entrepreneur in their community. And the same can be applied in a variety of other areas, from project finance within communities. So I'm interested in taking that energy kind of big picture experience, understanding kind of those inner workings, but also knowing, where is it shaky inside that system, and how can we redirect? And I think a lot of municipal-owned utilities are especially starting to look at how do we rethink our business model and start to repicture ourselves from a community perspective. So I'll stop there, and we can start a conversation around that.
Well, thank you, Seth. I think you really laid out a very broad and helpful framework to share the pattern of what we've seen going on all across the planet. And I'm sure a lot of us that are listening to this in the room would resonate with everything you shared to a great extent, of seeing the themes that you're talking about, from growth and an abstraction to value and quality of life, from centralized broad systems that are to meaningful community-based or distributed or decentralized. And not for just their own sake, but to recognize the nuance that is going on in the non-theoretical real world.
That's right.
Where we have to contextualize every activity and every system to be in context, to be more effective in the way that information, energy, resources, food, relationships, time, human capital, social capital, and financial capital, and all the different types of capital are more used in a more resilient and a more effective way for better outcomes. And we expand the number of perspectives that we actually value in the equation beyond just growth of one type of capital. So I feel that, would that sum up kind of what you were feeling to some extent?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me just continue with that, and then since that's where I see you going, it really resonates with a lot of the discussions that are going on here in California, and in the taking a regional approach to economic development. There's many policymakers and people that are not policymakers, all of us who just know our own lives and what we're experiencing around us. Wouldn't it be better to have a more community-based or regional-based approach. And that's, I think, the ethos behind the democratic, this democratic system that America was built on, to re-democratize capital, re-democratize the economy. And especially here in places like California, when we have so many different diverse regions, from the desert to the mountain to the north coast to the Central Valley to the urban, we have so many different systems, and we've found that in California economic development and California policy that it's so much more effective if we actually regionalize the conversations to create better outcomes.
Absolutely, and again, this gets into that social ecological area. Each region kind of has its own ecosystem, both from a social and environmental.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to think from our past in terms of this concept of permanence.
Mm-hmm.
That how things have operated in the past is really how things will operate in the future, and that kind of creates this mindset.
It's fundamentally unpredictable.
That's right.
And we know that things are changing faster in our society than ever before, and faster in the ecosystems around us.
So our ability to shift when necessary. So when you have a central system, let's take our water system. I mean, how much water does Southern California rely upon, either from the Colorado River or the Sacramento River Basin? Like I said, 20% energy moved into just to move water to Southern California. And then the alternative is, well, do we put in large...
Well, that's a great example of the need to create regional approach.
That's right.
And I think bringing it into the discussion of, well, a lot of us, what we're working on in our lives, because most of us that are listening to this or in this room aren't necessarily struggling with the issue of how do we manage the municipal water district.
Right.
But we're discussing, what we're talking about is an applicable pattern to every one of our lives, which is how do we relate more effectively to the communities around us? How do we relate more effectively to the people around us? How do we design our jobs, our business in context? And how do we support policymakers who are also working in relationship to their communities more effectively? And I think that's where you and I have a common passion, is to create capital flows and economic systems that match these more nuanced, distributed intelligence, resilient systems, where we recognize that the way that capital and banking and the industrialized model was created was based on a decentralized thing, but we have to then figure out how to rebuild a new model from the ground up and from the community up.
Are integrated. For example, I live in the Western Municipal Water District.
Yeah.
Part of the water, the Southern water system, but their rates have just gone tremendously sky high with the drought conditions. You look across the neighborhoods, and you're seeing the traditional lawn watering, green grass in the suburbs, and a lot of folks are just saying, I can't afford those water rates.
Well, those people are not. They're not necessarily in touch. If there was more of a community conversation about conservation, then
That's
there'd
right.
be more.
That's right. And certainly the wastewater, the water treatment district is trying to give out education and awareness and what have you. But now when you start to look at the market price of water, and I like market systems because it is important to get price signals to make informed decisions. So now the entrepreneur can come in and say, you don't have to have that brown grass in front of your yard. We'll tear out the yard. Matter of fact, there are incentives that are provided by the water district. So why not take a group of permaculturalists, if you will, and start to clear out these grass landscapes and put in kind of like Farmscape here in LA that goes in. They'll re-landscape, put in edible landscaping, come out instead of mowing your grass every week. They're coming out and planting, what's in season right now. and let's, give you a basket at your front door of food, that's coming right out of, your yard. And,
Well, I
and
think-
so now
I
you
think
can put
what
that
you're-
whole resiliency.
That's exactly right. And what you're saying, Seth, is the opportunities for abundance
Yes.
by being aware of what's going on around us and connecting and cooperating more effectively.
And then
So-
creating the business
So
system.
the challenge that I hear, that I see across the system, is that there's a paradigm shift that is underway, and there are many people that are on that shift and are doing things that they can to move in that way and create better systems, and there are many who are not. And the question that we hold in our hearts in these conversations is, what is it that is at the root of why paradigm shifts happen? And why are many people not moving in that, and what it is that needs to be done in community and relationships to actually drive a paradigm shift which will enable the likes of ourselves to create economic models on a group of people in a new paradigm that then enable us to create more capital flows in those new economic models. But we have to move a group of population to have a different mindset in order to adopt new systems, so that we can actually create a permaculture industry in the Riverside region. But if there's only 5% of the people doing it, we can't create an economics around it.
Create that tipping point.
So what's the psychology of paradigm shifts, which I think is the kind of things that we would look at, enable people to adopt the obvious. And I think that a lot of the things we've seen over the last 50 years are the curiosity that what Carter was talking about around decentralized solar power surprisingly was not adopted in the 70s, and we're still not there yet now, and we could have done this all in before 1980. So why is it that we did not adopt those paradigm shifts? How do we change the wiring of our minds and our brains and our relationships to adopt the obvious? And I think that is the root of what I feel we need to do as economic activists and economic theorists and economic designers, is to challenge our own assumptions. And you've laid a very good example of what was and what needs to happen.
Right.
But then I think that the pattern that you've articulated of looking at a whole system approach, region by region, will enable us to see that pattern and apply it in every different type of industry or paradigm necessary. And I think that I feel that you all get the gist of where we're going and articulating this pattern and coming down to the kind of things that I started with, which are community-based economics, relationships coming together, learning from each other, and hosting a dialogue and having a dialogue to help inform these kind of grand scale movements, globally.
Right. Well, I mentioned again Ostrom with this idea of self-organizing, and you and I were up in Sacramento last week.
Just last week
at the economic summit.
The California Economic Summit.
And you've been involved with that for 3 years or more now?
Yeah, 3 years.
So that's part of that transformation process.
For everyone's benefit, the California Economic Summit was born out of a regional approach where communities came together in 16 regions across the state to articulate what it is that is desired and what is needed in this region's economy. And each one of the regions came forth with a set of ideas, a set of needs, and a set of themes for actual more effective economy with a triple bottom line mindset: people, planet, profit. And there's 7 core themes: working landscapes, housing, infrastructure, regulations, and capital are some of the themes, and I'm the co-chair of the Capital Action Team. We're looking to recognize a lot of the concepts and ideas that we've talked about tonight and help design a distributed methodology for more effective capital flows. And one of the ways that we've articulated it is that our current economic model for capital is we have the global casino with money spinning around the world, right? And if money starts raining into California, our current system takes that rain and sends it off to the ocean instead of putting it down into the communities or like permeable concrete. So how do we create more effective systems for money to move into communities and for capital to flow, recognizing that capital has a decentralized opportunity as well? And then the challenges that we face in those conversations, as you were part of last week or 2 weeks ago was how do we create more effective community relationships and regional discussions for better coordination of activity in the communities to actually drive capital in the way. So we're
again,
actually
refocus on regional
resilience and regional context, and you know, on the description of our conversation tonight, Hollis mentioned my recent trip to Europe, and I was there in part because I was invited to talk about this regional approach that we're taking in California and share that with some economic leaders in Scandinavia, and it's taking a whole systems approach to capital by landing in a community or a region and identifying what are the components of the entire system and designing economic models and capital flows that are in touch with that region's population and that region's system and that region's resources. We were in a small town of about 800 people, which was one of the conversations that we held to help them assess from a regional and a bioregional approach what are the activities and resources here. And what we realized is that all the activities that they're doing, from community events to community-based businesses to community leaders coming together, designing projects together and having festivals, that they were doing so many things that were working, but because they were looking at it one way, from an old paradigm point of view, they didn't see the opportunity by connecting the dots and making things land more effectively, by being attuned to each other, by being attuned to what's going on around them. And therefore, at the end of the retreat, we saw an opportunity for more regionally coordinated activities and more community-based activities that would create much more value by just connecting the dots more effectively, by rewiring the way that they work.
Yeah. You know, the rewiring, I think, is a key challenge, because going back to
and a key opportunity, though.
Well, yeah, a key opportunity, which is certainly why I'm very fascinated about work cutting edge capital has been involved in. But just as we had the centralized power stations and the regulatory control at a centralized level, so true to our investment structures and pathways.
Exactly.
The establishment of accredited investors, and if you're not an accredited investor, then your pathway to investing is through your retirement plan, through insurance, products or what have you. But it's handed over to some other portfolio manager, if you will, that's going to make the decisions of which projects do I pick and choose. And that has really removed a sense of control over what. Yeah, I can choose between this socially responsible plan and this socially responsible plan, but it's not really. Can I really get into the portfolio?
Well, I really resonate with that, as you know, because these are the very challenges that me and my clients face when we're looking at the investment opportunities across the landscape.
Right.
And there's been an ongoing desire for all of my clients and people that I know across the country who desire to put money back into their own communities.
Right. But how do they do that? What are the structures?
Right, so we have to design new structures, which I think is really beyond the scope of what we have time for tonight. But that's one of the things.
But those are emerging. And
very much so.
Briefly, social impact bonds, project finance that could go all the way down to a community level, that investors can participate in. The direct public offerings.
Direct public offerings, community loan funds,
that's right.
Local community development, financial institutions. And what we've seen in the Economic Summit, and you were there in those conversations, there's 24 different ways that capital flows into communities, yet the missing piece that we saw was that that we see in the current system is there's not enough coordination going on region by region about how to create better systems for coordinated activity that then can help utilize the tools that people have in hand. What comes to mind is an analogy that I remember hearing from a spiritual teacher from India years ago, where the person shared two different models. One was hell, and one was heaven. And the hell version was people sitting around a pot of food, and they had long spoons. They were so long that they would put the spoon into the pot, but they couldn't get it into their mouths because it was too long, and it would go back here, and they just were all starving to death. And heaven is exactly the same, but people are feeding each other. And that whole thing about using the exact same tools from one mindset to another changes the entire dynamic through the way that we relate to each other. And that is the core challenge that I think I'm seeing in every conversation I've been in the last 10 years, is that people are not relating effectively enough for everyone to learn and share and see each other and feel each other so that we can actually create economic models based on better relationships. And this is, you know, the kind of thing that I keep coming back to, even though the discussion of TVA to community-based power, well, how do we get the people that are policymakers to see the value of community-based power when they've been trained in this centralized system model? And then those of us that are in relationships. So there's in every single level of our communities and our policy, we have opportunities for better relatedness and better communication to create better outcomes. And I think that's the...
Or the 2 points you made, we were talking earlier, you know, awareness, but before awareness, someone has to step up and start to work. To work. And you know, I think that consciousness is emerging, and folks are saying, this system isn't working for me.
Yeah.
And I want this other pathway.
Yeah.
And so they are stepping up.
Well, I think the people in this room are,
here.
Would all of you identify with this, is that you've all stepped up, and are we here together, and each of us has our own version of the stories you're hearing tonight, right? Isn't it? And I'm sure everyone who would be watching this, and everyone in our Living Economy Salon group, feels a resonance with what you're saying. We are stepping up, and it's the beginning. And now what we must do that have the new paradigm of living in our hearts is come together and relate more effectively, which is the whole point of why we do these salons, right, Hollis? And I know that, speaking for myself, I know that I know you well enough, we've known each other for years, we can sit here and talk like this continuously for about a week and not stop. Maybe we get some water and take a 5-minute break, but so I'd like to think maybe we just stop here, and I think this is probably a good place
Take
to
some questions.
take some questions and also have a conversation with all of you. And
Yeah, let's see if
so
anybody
thank
says
you
anything on the
for
web.
everybody for hearing what we've shared thus far. Thank you, Seth, for your brilliant presentation and this engaging discussion. Do we have any? So Hollis right now is looking on to see if there was any questions on our posted.
No, it doesn't look like it. If you are watching right now and want to ask a question, go onto our Facebook page, Living Economy Salon, and type a question into the comments, and we'll go look at it.
We'll check in about 5 minutes. I think we're going to go another 15 minutes or so, you think?
Sure.
Yeah.
So
what's going on in the room? How do you all feel based on what we've discussed? And maybe we can all share what's on our minds, and then we can just have a conversation. We'll just quickly each make a point or raise your question, and then we'll continue our dialogue. So for Chris, and then Don, and then Ray, and anybody else.
So thank you both for this fascinating conversation. Really excited to be here. My question is, it sounded like, Greg, toward the end, it sounded like you were saying that there's an education piece. I want to invite you to elaborate on what it seemed like was an education piece around just a way to get community members to educate them about better relationships that would fit within a context of the kind of capital flows that you're talking about. So I guess I wanted to invite you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I will. Great. So let's go then Don, but I'll get to that, and then beautiful, Don.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on something that Seth has experience in, which is the risk analysis. I'm a software engineer, and there is actually a discipline of software risk management. It looks different than financial risk management. But one of the things that occurs to me is we're entering a time of exceeding risk. Complex systems that are going into volatile modes. So, like, what would social risk look like, for example, or say a water system? How do you analyze the risks to our water system, for example? things like that. Now, that's a huge topic, I realize.
Great question. So how do we analyze the different kinds of risks that are emerging in our complex world?
Yeah.
Great question.
How do we integrate that with our...
Beautiful. We both have some comments on that. And Ray, what are your thoughts?
Well, perhaps this is more of a deeper dialogue, but I wanted to just bring up something, which is, we talked about assumptions and questioning the founding premises or founding assumptions on which we base centralized systems and so on. Now, going into a more relational, community-based paradigm, some of the assumptions that are created that run the current system in play, for example, prices and GDP, they were based on understanding or requirement at the time. So prices, for example, was to take the local value that was agreed upon in barter systems, but in order for it to commoditize it and ship it in another location, you need to have something consistent. So now, when you couldn't account for all the different price activity that was happening, then a guy like Keynes comes along and says, let's add all this stuff up, and that's going to give us the overall health. So that worked for that time, whereas now we're coming back to it, going back to the local paradigm. Where do these things that we hold as, immutable feature in terms of, do prices really matter? Do these measures really matter? If we decentralize the use of these actual systems, then the idea of centralized commerce, so California is a producer of produce for everyone else. What happens to that? So these are the things I want to bring up and get your thoughts on.
Well, I think that you're asking kind of the same kind of question that Chris does, which is, how do we create these relational models more effectively? Because in context, when there's a group of human beings work together in relationship, then those dynamics enable more effective agreement structures that are in context to what's going on, rather than something that is outside of the system of that particular set of relationships, which is a centralized model where we have to work with something that was designed outside of our relationship, rather than us coming up with our own version. And that's rather abstract way to say it, but I feel that this is the very structure that we are looking as emerging in communities designing their own currencies or designing their own energy systems or designing their own food systems. It's the fundamental root is developing processes and tools and dynamics for relationships to improve and people to work more effectively in integrated cooperation. I think that is really what I feel the kind of root of what is the problem. It's the way that we think and the way that we relate, and the kind of things that there was that book written that if we just do what we learned in kindergarten, we'd have a much better society. But how do we go back to that? And I think that's probably a topic of some articles that we can post on the website. But I just wanted to say that it really comes back to what we already know. Just like that when we were 14 years old, we had it all wired into us, and we were educated out of what we knew, and we have to come back to what we know and relate to each other directly. And then from those direct relationships, just like Judy Wicks in her restaurant, she had her community of relationships, and it created an entire economic system that is a thriving model for that local economy by her just relating to the human beings that walked into a restaurant. So then it's actually far less abstract, and it's far more direct and personal. And then developing psychological and emotional tools to relate more effectively together and intimately is some of the things. And I think that applies directly to what you're speaking to, Ray, in a more broad sense. And I want to respond quickly to what Don said. If we could just move on from that to Don, and then we can go back and continue our conversation, if that's okay. And then I know you have a question. And I just want to say briefly, and I want you to go from here, is that before we had the kind of computing power and the distributed intelligence that we have on the broad internet now, we had very simple models that we used to have to hand calculate. When I started in economics, we would just use little calculators to design. You can only put in like 3 to 5 factors in an economic equation, maybe 10. And the central banking policies are designed in maybe 20 or 30 different factors in managing the monetary system of an economy. Yet we know that reality is much more robust, with hundreds, if not thousands, of factors that need to be considered. And the promise of big data and the kind of distributed analysis that we have enable us to have much more robust tools to address these very complex systems and create regional or sub-regional approaches to every one of these questions. And then once we have those coherent sets of information and relationships, we can actually design economic and financial pathways. Would you say that's the direction that we would be?
Yeah. You know, these are really messy and challenging issues, but folks are addressing them, and that's why I've always been fascinated by electricity, because there are really two commodities that are very similar, electricity and currency. That when you run out of currency, you have runs on the bank. Mm-hmm. When you run out of electricity, that light switch doesn't come on, and you have, you know, really that they call it the value of lost load, and what, you know, it becomes the economists really struggle with what that value of lost load is, and it's going to vary for different participants. I was on the trade floor of Synergy Power and Marketing in 1998 and 99. And traditionally, electricity, wholesale power, will trade at about $50. Well, usually, maybe back in those days, anywhere from $20 to $50 a megawatt hour. That's equivalent on your retail bill of around 2 cents to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. California retail rates are somewhere in the 16 to 20 some odd cent range. You know, so at 20 to 50, and then we had a hiccup in '98. We saw prices shoot up to $4,000 a megawatt hour for certain periods. Then in '99, we saw prices hit for certain hours $10,000 a megawatt hour. That's $10 a kilowatt hour. So if your air conditioning unit, 3-ton unit, runs about 3K per hour, so your air conditioner, if you're charged real-time rate, would be about $30 an hour to run at that time. Synergy dropped $125 million on the trade floor in 4 days. And there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. They had sold a bunch of strike options at $30 calls.
So how does this relate to this question?
So going back to how it relates is that the value, we're dealing in a world of cost, market, and value. A steel mill operating in Ohio that has steel operating in their kiln, if electricity runs out and all of that steel goes cold in their mill, imagine what the cost is on that.
Right.
Convert that to a cost per kilowatt hour.
How do we create better risk systems for? This is the heart of the question.
So that's right. So the risk system changes. It becomes different for that steel mill. How does he start to look at? He can no longer be dependent upon the centralized system to manage his risk effectively for him, or the instability that's on there. He has to put in other types of systems. The air conditioning unit, we can't afford real-time prices at $30, and so there was an article that said,
that then is a different way of saying that we need more data and inputs. And
no, we don't need any more data.
But we need more understanding of what's going on in the context.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, because Hulk Hogan, there's an economist that set up locational marginal prices on the power grid, and every substation has its own price. And there was an article in the New York Times just last week, and I'll be writing a blog about this. It'll be hitting Cutting Edge Capital within a week. But they're seeing that, on Long Island Sound, when a certain power plant can't operate and temperatures reach a certain temperature, outdoor temperatures, then the price of electricity on Long Island Sound just skyrockets. And the mayor of this town is saying, how am I going to deal with this type of uncertainty and what have you? Well, the way in which the mayor deals with that is you work behind the system where the bottleneck is. You bring in energy efficiency, demand response, distributed renewable resources. Yes, those might have certain higher costs at certain times than this volatility, but now you're managing volatility as opposed to price, and we're starting to shift to value because I can create green jobs.
So let me make sure I heard you right, because you were saying that mayor can bring in other components that were not in the decentralized anonymous system that were relating to that particular town. Energy efficiency. When you said distributed, you really mean local
rooftop solar,
local sources of
community
energy,
solar. That's right.
And also different kind of processes that are creating a more robust regional approach.
That's right.
So then I think you're basically saying is that going from a decentralized system that is very brittle and that breaks under pressure to a distributed and decentralized system that is actually working more effectively region by region by region.
And it's working effectively because the way in which the payments of the cost to that system are being transferred. In that volatile system, you've got traders that are looking at building these sophisticated models. They'll know when temperatures and
but the traders are sitting in some trading floor somewhere else, and they're not in those communities.
No, they're not in those communities, and so they're sucking dollars out of that community.
Right.
And so what the mayor needs to focus on is if I can, basically put in a robust ecosystem of renewable energy efficiency, demand response, I've effectively arbed out and retained within that community dollars that can circulate.
So that theme of a mayor working more effectively in their region is the thing that we're seeing and we've talked about throughout the night is to help create better relations region by region. And I think that's where you're actually going with your work, Don, as well.
What he was saying actually reminds me of in a complex system, one of the things we do when you have a lot of volatility, we put in a buffer.
Yes.
And that will smooth out the volatility.
Right.
Classic example is from the Bible.
Yeah.
The 7 fat years, 7 lean years.
Yes.
And Joseph said, Pharaoh, you got to build up a granary.
Yeah.
And during using the surplus, and during the 7 lean years, you eat off the granary.
The Bible has
let's move on. We've got about a few more minutes. We're going to wrap up, and I'd like Alexandria
I think I finally saw what the pattern is because I have 2 specific examples on my mind that relate to both the issue of energy efficiency, distributed generation, and the whole community involvement, but I finally saw what the umbrella pattern was in the conversation, and see if that makes sense to you, that what we're looking for are medium-scale systems. That on the micro level, it's us as individuals, we operate according to whatever it is that motivates us, and then we have these big systems. But it's that medium-scale communication systems that are lacking. Like on this micro level, we gather as a group, we see what needs to be done, but making it it's like a stepped pyramid.
Absolutely.
Like if some of those medium steps are lacking, then we don't seem to be able to make that leap.
Yeah, right.
So again, on the individual level, we have these beautiful conversations happening, but how do we chunk up those mechanisms of collective action into larger and larger molecules, or whatever that, like from atoms to molecules to cells to simple organisms, like somewhere in that food chain, some of these like medium systems are missing.
Absolutely.
And the 2 specific examples that I'm chewing on and I don't have any answers for, one is in terms of distributed energy efficiency of the system. And we all know that the big objective of in the grand scheme of things, we would love to have more resilient system, and we would love to have better quality of life. And yet, somewhere along that chain, there is communication breakdown, because I know one of the big pieces in the building these more responsive energy systems are the smart meters.
Yes.
And that's such a major breakdown in terms of generating a greater quality of life, because smart meters lead to so much suffering in terms of quality of life situation.
You mean in terms of the technology
Yeah, the
used in the smart
technology
meters?
is truly.
Yeah.
So then let's not go into that.
Yeah,
probably
exactly. I
agree,
don't
but
want
let's
to
talk
go
about
into
the
smart
promise.
meters. No,
Yeah.
I don't want to go into smart meters, but what I'm saying, that's an example of where on the micro level, there is something that's really thorny. And those of us who are in our individual, luckily I don't have a smart meter in my apartment, but I have a friend who does, and she is sick, and she can't do anything. Like, she pretty much has to get rid of her apartment. That's the only thing that she can do. She can't live there. She can't, like, there's that, it's like, yes, we want an efficient, distributed, decentralized, and we can't live with these things. So how do we as individuals create a good quality of life when we don't have exactly what's missing, that feedback loop of the micro into medium? It's like, how do we bench together and get rid of the smart meters in our
Right, and
apartment?
I feel like
Just real quick on the smart meters.
I would say we move on from that.
Yeah, I don't want to go
Let's
deep
not get into
into
it.
it.
We're about to wrap up. Let's
On the
not get into the
structural
topic.
level, it's about that medium scale feedback where we can incorporate.
I think we just have to create more effective communication and conversations
Yes.
with each other so we can coordinate more effective place by place.
And that's exactly my question: is how do we create those medium scale conversations?
Yeah, right.
But I want to point out from a market's perspective. Yes, the technology that is in the smart meters, we don't want to go into, but it's a challenge. But the concept of what the smart meter provides is very powerful, because
beautiful vision.
Right. Because if you look
I
at an economist, Hernando de Soto, who has gone into economies, primitive economies and cultures, and start to recognize that if you can capture the value or identify a property right and transfer title of that property right, then you're able to build an economy with the recognition of that property transfer. And so what a smart meter in concept was designed to do, when we're trading carbon, when we're looking at renewable energy credits, when we're trying to look at these attributes that we're trying to get a sense of monetizing or creating some type of tangible value that we've traditionally viewed as an externality to the system, we're trying to create a tangible value to, then we can start to transact within that value. And you can actually start to look at a transition of that value. Carbon, is it a commodity, or could it actually be a community-based currency? Mm-hmm. And so we start to see transitions within. Now, smart meters we throw out, but certainly web-based systems are available to do that as well.
There's another beautiful example that we know about called M-Pesa that I think we talked about in another salon, where it's in Nigeria, where they created a bank based on people's cell phones to text money to each other and text money to a centralized. And that when that text-based bank started, the bankers in the community didn't think it would be, in the country didn't think it'd be very effective. But now it's actually the largest bank in the country. It's in Kenya, I beg your pardon. But in that idea of articulating the data and the activity on a very micro scale enabled.
And having the medium chain structure that aggregates that.
Exactly, the medium chain structure. That M-Pesa was the medium chain structure. So I'd like to know that we could go on forever.
Yes.
And I think we should stop here unless you would like to continue, or.
That's great with me. I don't have to watch.
Yeah, I think it's around.
Ray, did you have anything?
Maybe let's go around the room, and maybe I'd like all of us to say some closing thoughts, and maybe Ray could start, and we'll go around the room just I think it'd be really valuable for us to just share a minute or so each about what our insights and what we've taken away and what we'd like to contribute, and maybe we can seed some future conversations from this as well.
One thing that really kind of struck me is when Seth mentioned.
By the way, would it be good for everyone to come up and make your 1 minute?
No.
No. Okay, no. Okay, Robin says no. See, I was just asking.
No, Hollis has a TV show for that.
Okay, good. So we're going to get each of us give a wrap up in our closing thoughts.
So what clicked for me with Alexander's point and what Seth said about we don't need more data. Okay, so one of the assumptions that we're struggling with, that we're getting to these local resilient technologies and structures and relationships and understanding, and somehow there's something in the way we think that we think somehow we need to still connect it to some other centralized entity. So when we talk about big data, some data management system has to know everything that's going on so that somebody else can manage it when something big goes wrong. Okay? That's one assumption, right? The other thing is that whatever we're iterating towards, whether those kinds of structures are even relevant. And when we're talking about going from small-scale systems to large-scale systems, we tend to describe them in hierarchy rather than in holarchy. So for example, in systems thinking, Francisco Varela's work on autopoiesis for self-making systems is about how system sustains itself at every level with different inputs. And so when we're starting to talk about these kinds of topics, it's really good to be mindful of understanding what works and how that connects to the next level up, because I think that now starts to fill in the picture for whoever is participating at whatever level. And I think that piece of the conversation has probably not been thought about, but not been publicly expressed. And so I just wanted to presence that.
Beautifully said.
Grace talked about those connections, and you talked about relationships here. There is a lot of data, and I've kind of got lost in a bit of it here. But what's important to me is what the cultures that we're living in, what we focus on, what our objective is, and how we separate ourselves from the paradigms that we currently have, so that we participate more effectively in these new systems and these medium-level aggregations here, because it does take a community. It's not an individual effort.
Thank you. Robin, any comments?
I just want to continue the conversation, and I understand the whole system that Ray is talking about, but I do want to go back to what Alexander's talking about, and how do you scale? How do we scale this conversation to community, and then how do we tie to California? How do we make that connection from what you're dealing with up here and what we want to talk about here?
Great question.
That's the next salon.
The next salon is how do we tie to the big system from the micro? How do we create the middle structures? Maybe that would be a great conversation. Thomas.
Thanks. Yeah, these are some really, as always, some really spectacular ideas, very thought-provoking. I really love the mayor of Long Island, or whatever the town, that really is a good thing to think about. And it brings me to what you were saying about re-democratizing this paradox of capitalism and true democracy, from below, the definition of it. And having worked with campaigning for Ellen Brown, who's behind public banking, or platforms for California public banking now, and going from community to community, trying to get that started on a regional level. I think about the mayor concept of Long Island there, and the first thing that comes to my mind is, but until we do something about getting this money out of politics, there's somebody that's going to be funding that mayor's election that's going to, once again, be a stumbling block to this democratization. So it almost always comes back every time I'm at these salons that we really got to do something about this, getting the money out of politics. But we have to re-democratize this economy somehow, and that's what I'm trying.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Oh, you just reminded me of a second thing. I'll try to do two things in a short time. One is you mentioned Eleanor Ostrom had been a fan of her work for a long time. One of the things is that she's actually presented a kind of third economic model. You have the public and the private and the commons. And it's important to understand that there's all the strengths and weaknesses. And a lot of her work was in what does it take to make kind of a viable commons. It's stakeholder-managed commons. The other thing is talking about the buffering and the flow and the volatility and all that. A long time ago, a fellow named James Forrester came up with a way of modeling complex systems. It's called system dynamics, and it's turned out to be very useful. That was the technology that was used to do the models used in the Limits to Growth book. And so it's still very relevant. And I'd like to actually be fighting for doing a salon on that. There's an excellent introduction to that. It's called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. And she was one of the original members of Forrester's team. And it's just beautifully laid out. One of the things that comes out of that is that there is such a tendency when people start thinking of these things, think, oh, we can intervene here and make this work. And one of the main things that Forrester was saying is that people can fairly easily identify the right lever, and they practically always push it in the wrong direction. So they actually want to create more problems than they solve. So it's a tremendously important tool of knowledge to have.
Thank you. Alexander, closing thoughts.
One of the things that struck me are the pieces that are floating in my head. One is when you said we don't need any more data. And I think that's the purpose of those medium-scale structures would be, is to aggregate the bottom-level data, because we're all overwhelmed with way too much. And that's where that communication challenge comes in, like too much data points. At some point, they have to be aggregated in some kind of more meaningful chunks. But at the same time, if there is a dissent, even on the micro level, that needs to be noticed and honored and listened whether that needs to be acted upon. For example, that one person who got sick from the smart meter. It's like that does need to be honored, even though we want to have what the smart meters have to offer. And yet, if we don't honor that, even if it's just one person out of 100 who's really sick, we need to both aggregate the benefits and honor the micro and have some mechanism of
feedback loops.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things that's really sticking with me is the idea of working within the structures we have, innovating with the structures we have to democratize capital, create the capital flows that will support the micro, medium scale entities that will basically embody the kind of smart systems, complex systems approach that that you guys have been talking about. And another thing that's floating around in there is this: what's the other side of DPOs? That would be some sort of voluntary aggregation of small investors, like some of your clients, Greg. And there just has to be a way, it seems to me, to come together and create those capital flows. It's an idea whose time has come, and the regulations and whatever's in place right now that's preventing that will soon become obsolete.
Thank you. Alice, any closing thoughts?
I just want to thank you guys for the work you're doing. It just makes me happy to know that two people with the values that you both have are out there in the world of economics and finance, like fighting the good fight. It's good to know.
Hugging the good hug.
Yes, exactly.
I'll close with what came to heart when you were all talking is the thing I heard, which I don't know for sure, was on Einstein's office wall in Princeton, which was, what is often counted does not count, and what counts is often not counted. And that helps me to express more effectively what I meant by big data is, it's not so much that we need more data, but we need to count the things that are not counted in the equation. And we now have the capacity with more computing power to coordinate many more factors in the decision-making process than we had before. And big data does play a role into that, but it's not for data's sake. It's about creating much more a nuanced understanding of reality with a whole systems approach. And then when we have a whole systems approach and we come up with more information or more context, well, that will not have any value whatsoever unless we maximize the quality of relationships and how we relate to each other and those new systems and that new information, until we have to relate more effectively across the board and coordinate the feedback loops from the micro to the macro. So I'll leave it at that. And Seth, final word, sir.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to sit down and share and have this conversation. Always a great event, and just great conversations with great people, inspiring people. All of you in the work that you're doing, and we do have a lot of work ahead of us. It's been interesting to kind of be a feedback from what I'm hearing, that we've kind of identified this centralized, decentralized, and this middleware issue that needs to be addressed. I think that kind of circled through, and certainly that is where a lot of us are really working, and I think it's going to happen. The tipping point is about to happen. And that's right.
So stay tuned, everybody. Tune into Hollis's TV show on that channel.
You'll hear about it.
And you'll be hearing about it. And again, thanks for tuning in, and thanks for all of us to be here together, and love and light and better relationships.
Thanks for staying up late in Sweden.
Yeah, join us.
Is he here?
Yeah, and thank you, Kit. We had Kit from Hawaii on there too.
Okay.
So God bless.
Someone turn it off.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.